This webinar is our joint venture with the World Bank, where experts from the bank will share their recent findings with the school community. We hope you'll gain exclusive insights into the cutting-edge research by the bank and have time to reflect on possible applications. If you have any questions or comments, please wait for the Q&A session or leave your messages in the chat. Now, I'm pleased to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Hamza Zahid. I'd like to take a moment to briefly introduce him. Dr. Zahid is an economist in the World Bank's Prospects Group. His research focuses on the intersection of international macroeconomics, commodity markets, and climate change. At the Prospects Group, he contributes to the semi-annual Commodity Markets Outlook and has contributed to the surveillance work on critical minerals. His current projects explore the links between global commodity prices, exchange rates, and inflation. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Houston, and master's in economics from Dalhousie University, and a BCom in economics from McGill University. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Zahid. Dr. Zahid, please share your slides.
Thank you, UNG. Let me just share the PDF. Right, so it's full screen now, right?
Yes, it's full screen.
Okay, thank you so much, UNG, and it's great to be here and to present this work. And thanks to everyone for attending. So this is a joint work with Gert Peersman, who is a professor at the Ghent University. And the objective of this project really is to understand the relationship between commodity prices and the US dollar exchange rate. And just to give you some background or some motivation why we are doing this, so since in 1970s, there has been this very persistent negative correlation between the US dollar and commodity prices, as you can see in this plot over here. And this relationship is important because it acts as a buffer for non-US commodity exporting and importing countries because it dampens the effects of commodity price swings when measured in local currencies. So, for example, if you think of a commodity exporter, if commodity prices decrease, there's a loss in commodity export revenue. But because commodities are priced in US dollars, so if the dollar appreciates simultaneously, that loss is mitigated when that export revenue is converted back to the local currency. But surprisingly, post-COVID, this correlation reversed, where an increase in commodity prices was accompanied by a dollar appreciation and vice versa. So you can see here post-2021, they are both increasing together. And this reversal received a lot of attention because not only it decreased the export revenue for commodity exporters, but it also increased the inflationary impact on commodity importers. So commodity prices were higher, and also because the currencies of these importers depreciated against the dollar, so their imports also became more expensive. And this was already a high inflation environment. So because of that, it received a lot of attention and basically raised the question that what's driving these two variables and what's the cause behind the recent shift. So essentially, we want to answer these questions by studying this relationship. So in this paper, we examine what's driving the dollar exchange rate and commodity prices, and we answer the following three questions. Firstly, what are the factors that determine the relationship between the US dollar exchange rate and commodity prices? Secondly, how does this relationship change over time? And finally, what are the underlying drivers behind the recent post-COVID shift in this relationship? So for the first question, we are basically in this paper going to develop a theoretical model and then also propose a novel identification strategy for our empirical work that is going to allow us to basically disentangle the exogenous drivers from these endogenous variables and see what are the factors which are driving these two prices. And then the second and the third questions are basically going to follow from the empirical results. So let me uh, go to the approach. But before that, I briefly want to discuss the related literature. So I'm not going to go through all these different papers. There has been quite a bit of work on these different topics. Uh, but very broadly, the literature has raised some interrelated questions. Firstly, there's a camp which says that it's exchange rate fluctuations which drive commodity prices. Uh, then there is another set of papers that argue the opposite and basically talk about the opposite causality and say that it's commodity prices that affect the US dollar exchange rate. And then there's a third camp which basically says that it's not the dollar cycle or the commodity cycle, but some third component or some underlying drivers such as the U.S. monetary policy, which is driving both these variables. Uh, so clearly, there is some endogeneity to this relationship between these variables. Uh, in recent work, for example, by Killian and Zhu, they do take into account some of this endogeneity while focusing on the oil market. Then there's this other work from the BIS and the IMF, which focus on the positive correlation between the dollar and commodity prices that happened recently. And but their results are sometimes different. In some cases, they actually find the opposite results. So in our work, we basically want to contribute to this literature by providing a structural framework where we isolate the exogenous drivers which are moving these two prices. So for that, we're going to use an approach which consists of two parts. We'll have a theoretical model and an empirical model. Uh, where in the theoretical model, we are going to develop this quantitative three-country macro model, which is going to be a new Keynesian model with the global commodity market embedded in there. And drivers of endogenous variables are going to include US and non-US demand shocks. So you can think of these as preference shocks coming from the households. US and non-US supply shocks, you can think of these as technology shocks in the firm's production function, or you can think of them as productivity shocks coming from the firm's side. Then we have these commodity market specific shocks, for example, in oil supply disruption. And then we have these US nominal shocks, such as US monetary policy or risk premium shocks. So the idea essentially to have these shocks is to provide a minimum set of shocks that provide us a full economic coverage, so to speak. So basically we have real and nominal shocks. Real shocks are further divided into non-commodity shocks and then commodity shocks, and then the non-commodity are divided into demand and supply and US and non-US shocks. And then this model which we are going to solve, it's going to provide us with impulse responses to these different shocks. And those impulse responses we will use as sign restrictions for our empirical model, as I'll show you in more detail. And also the model is going to provide us a lens through which we are going to basically interpret the empirical findings. And then on the empirical side, we're going to propose an identification strategy, which is going to disentangle the underlying exogenous structural shocks driving commodity prices and the dollar. And we'll do this by generalizing this structural VAR model, or vector autoregression model from the literature. And essentially, we're going to take a baseline model from the literature and incorporate relative responses of US and global variables. And that is going to allow us to disentangle US and non-US demand and supply shocks. And as you will see in the empirical results, this division between US and non-US shocks is going to be important to understand the US dollar exchange rate movements, because eventually the dollar price is a relative variable in itself. So then, before I move on, I just want to say that these two different parts, or these two different components, are basically going to complement each other. So in the benefit of the empirical strategy is that absent some of the sign restrictions or identification restrictions that we impose, it's going to capture a broad set of mechanisms which are generating the empirical results. But then the model, the theoretical model, is going to narrow down that set of mechanisms based on our choice of parameters in the model, or the structure of the model. But then the benefit of the model is that it's going to be tied to fundamental underlying parameters. And essentially, as you will see, that is going to be important to understand or interpret the results, and also to basically conduct policy analysis. So then let me go to the empirical model. So today I'm going to focus mainly on the empirical exercise. I'm not going to talk about the theoretical model, because the novel part of the project really is on the empirical side. I'll briefly mention or describe the theoretical model when we go to the empirical identification. But really the contribution of the paper and the interesting results come from the empirical exercise. So then for the empirical exercise, we are essentially estimating the structural VAR model, where we have these endogenous variables. We have US and global GDP, US and global prices, a commodity price index, and the US dollar exchange rate. And then basically the idea is that we collect these endogenous variables in this vector YT, and what we're saying is that this data, which is our variables, is generated by this VAR process with these mutually uncorrelated structural shock vector WT. And now we want to estimate this model, but we cannot estimate it directly because the model is under identified. So which essentially means that we have more unknowns than the number of equations. So we want to provide the model with more information to essentially solve that system of equations. And that we are going to do with the help of the predictions from the theoretical model. And in particular, as I said, the theoretical model is going to give us these impulse responses, which we will use to impose sign restrictions in this on the empirical side for identification. So on the sign restrictions are essentially nothing else but imposing signs on the impact response of these endogenous variables in the model, which you can see over here on the left-hand side, to these 6 structural shocks. And these signs are going to tell us that which shock is which in that vector WT and what exactly it does. So I'm not going to go through all these different signs over here in this table. But just as an example, if you look at this US demand shock, when there is a US demand shock, that means US demand increases. That is going to increase US output and put upward pressure on US prices. Because of spillovers through the trade channel and through the commodity channel, it's going to increase global output and global prices as well. commodity prices are going to increase and the US dollar is going to appreciate. So we impose these signs, but the exact reasoning for these signs is really coming from the theoretical model. So I'll briefly go to the theoretical side and discuss how we are essentially generating these signs and how we can understand the mechanisms involved. So if I go to the theoretical model for a short moment, we have on the theoretical side these households, and the households essentially maximize their expected discounted sum of their period utility, which is a function of consumption. And that maximization problem is subject to certain constraints, and that consumption in this period utility is basically an aggregate of manufactured goods and commodities. So households which are consuming, they are consuming both manufactured goods and they're consuming commodities. And this eta naught over here is basically a parameter which governs the elasticity of substitution between these manufactured goods and these commodities. And we calibrate it in a way that manufactured goods and commodities are basically complements. So in order to consume some manufactured goods, the household needs to consume some commodities as well. So for example, you can think of an appliance. If someone is trying to use an appliance, they need some type of energy source. If you can think of some other durable good like a car, if you're using a car, you need some energy source to run that car. So in order to consume some manufactured good, because these are complements, so you need some commodities as well. Then these manufactured goods are basically a bundle of domestic goods and foreign goods. So you combine domestic goods that you produce at home and the imported manufactured goods in order to produce a final manufactured good. And this consumption bundle is subject to these preference shocks or these home bias shocks, which is given by this gamma 1 over here. So this gamma 1 is basically going to follow a stochastic process, and this is going to be our US demand shock. So what happens when there is a US demand shock? So let's say there is a positive US demand shock or a positive home preference or a home bias shock. So consumers in the US suddenly realize that they want to consume more US manufactured or US made goods. So this gamma 1 is going to increase. That is going to increase the demand for US manufactured goods. And as I said, that manufactured goods and commodities are complements in the consumption. So because demand for manufactured goods increases, demand for commodities is also going to increase. So because demand for commodities increases, commodity price is going to go up. So you see in this first plot over here, in the second row, that in response to a US demand shock, commodity prices are increasing. Then, because this is a US aggregate demand shock, that increases US output and it also increases US prices. So you see in the second and the third plots over here that US output increases, which is the blue dashed line, and also US prices are going to increase. Then, because this is a home bias shock, so US consumers consume more of the US manufactured good and reduce their consumption or their demand for foreign goods. That is going to basically improve the trade balance. So the imports are going to increase, the trade balance improves, and because of that, the US dollar is going to appreciate, which you can see over here in the orange curve in the fourth plot over here. Then, so this is how basically we are getting the different sign restrictions from this initial response of these variables from the model. But we do not want to impose, because we are studying the impact on the US dollar and commodity prices, we want to impose minimum number of restrictions and we don't want to impose directly, for example, a restriction on exchange rates. So we introduce these relative responses, because otherwise, if you see over here, in a response to both a non-US and a US demand shock, other than the exchange rate, everything else moves in the same direction. So if we don't impose a sign restriction on the exchange rate, then we have to impose some additional restriction here. So what we do is that we say that in response to a US demand shock, we find that US output increases more than global output. So the relative response is going to be negative over here. So you see the yellow line is negative. And then in response to a non-US demand shock, global output or non-US output increases more than US output, so there is a positive relative response here. So this is basically the reasoning that we use to impose these restrictions. So for because of that, we have all these positive signs in this fourth column over here. And then for the relative responses, we have these negative signs for the US demand shock, and we have these positive restrictions for the non-US demand shock. So we use similar reasoning from the model to impose these other restrictions and get these other shocks too. And then I just want to add, as I said, that we use the minimum number of restrictions to isolate the shocks of interest. So we're going to ignore the model impulse responses, the theoretical models results, which are sensitive to calibration within a standard range of parameter values, or which are inconclusive based on the literature. So then we want to estimate this model basically. And we estimate this model. And what I'm showing you over here are basically the results from the empirical model now. And what you see is in the top part, this is the commodity price index. And then we have in the bottom, the response of US dollar exchange rate to each of these 6 structural shocks. And all these shocks are normalized to increase commodity prices. So in the top row over here, you can see that in response to all these 6 different structural shocks, commodity prices increase. So the impulse response basically increases on impact. And because of that, you can think, so for example, if there's a commodity shock, you can think of this as a negative oil supply shock. So a negative oil supply shock means there's some oil supply disruption due to some conflict or some other geopolitical tension that is going to decrease oil supply, and that increases the price of oil or price of commodity. Then, for example, for a US supply shock, you can think of this as a positive technology shock. So there's a positive technology or productivity shock in the US that increases the marginal product of all the other inputs, because commodities are used as inputs in the production function. So demand for commodities is going to increase, and price of commodities is going to increase again over here. So because of this normalization, there's this interpretation that in some cases this is a negative, for example, supply shock. In other cases, this is a positive technology shock. Then these impulse responses basically indicate that it's only in response to a US demand shock, which pushes both commodity prices and the US dollar to co-move. So you can see that in response to all these shocks, which increase commodity prices in the top row, the commodity prices are going up, but the US dollar is basically either decreasing or it's non-significant, whereas it's only in response to a US demand shock, which is the fourth column here, that commodity prices increase and the real exchange rate or the dollar's value also increases. So it's only the US demand shock, which in our framework or from our results can basically push both commodity prices and the dollar in the same direction, or because of this shock, we can have a positive correlation. All the other shocks move them in an opposite direction, including this commodity shock. So there has been a discussion in some other papers that this positive co-movement in the US in the post-COVID period could have been because US suddenly started, or the US dollar suddenly started to behave like a commodity currency, because the US is becoming a big a natural gas exporter. For example, right now US is producing shale, and there's a large decrease in imports of crude over the past few years, and US is also exporting natural gas. So it's basically a net exporter of natural gas. So there was this claim that it could be that the US dollar is now behaving as a commodity currency, for example, similar to Saudi currency or Canada's currency. But from our framework, we find that that's not the case. In response to a commodity shock, still when commodity prices are increasing, the US dollar still either depreciates or there's a very minor, non-significant impact. But there could be this problem because we're looking at the commodity price index and its relationship with the dollar exchange rate. It could be that this is masking, the index is basically masking some of the heterogeneous relationships between commodity shocks, between different commodities and the US dollar. So, for example, crude oil and the US dollar could have a slightly different relationship than an overall commodity price index. So for that, we also estimate, we basically augment our model with these other commodities, and I'm just showing you some selected commodities over here. We have a number of other commodities too in the paper, but I'm just showing you the commodities which are especially relevant for the post-COVID period and this debate in the literature. So what you're seeing over here are the impulse responses to a commodity shock. And when we are looking at the relationship in the top panel between crude oil and the dollar exchange rate, and then in the bottom panel between natural gas price and the dollar exchange rate. So again, we find that a commodity shock that results in higher crude oil prices or higher natural gas prices again does not have a very strong impact on the dollar exchange rate. So clearly it's not a positive impact. It's either a negative impact or it's an impact which is close to zero. So what I've showed you so far, these are the average movements or the average patterns in the data. Our data basically goes from 1973 to 2024. And we estimate that empirical model over the full data. So these impulse responses basically captured the average movements or the average patterns in the data. So if we want to zoom in into specific periods, such as the post-COVID period, we do a historical decomposition. So what you're seeing over here are the historical decompositions that we again get from the empirical model. And in the top panel, we have the response of the commodity price index and the dollar. And then in the bottom panel, again, we have the commodity price index and the dollar. But in the top panel, we are showing the contribution of the US demand shock to this increase in commodity prices that happened in the post-COVID period. And then this increase in the dollar's value, which happened simultaneously in the post-COVID period. In the bottom panel, which has this multiple shaded region, we are again showing you the same exact movements in these two variables, but now the shaded regions are capturing the contribution of different, basically all the other structural shocks. So the red part is capturing the contribution of the US demand shock, whereas this multicolored is capturing the other shocks. And again, you see that it's only the US demand shock, which is the red shaded region, that increased both commodity prices and the US dollar in this post-COVID, post-2021 period. And all the other shocks, which are these shaded regions, are basically moving them in the opposite direction. So what we find from this is that in the post 2020 period, or how we interpret these results, is that it was really the US demand differentials. For example, there was a very large fiscal stimulus done in the US relative to other countries, which not only strengthened the dollar, but it also basically increased global commodity prices. And then in the paper, we look at other historical episodes of positive correlation or positive co-movement between the dollar and the exchange rate. And again, we find that it is mainly this US demand shock which results in this positive co-movement. So then if I go to more broader results from our analysis, what I find is that for commodity price movements, they're mainly driven by shocks that shift commodity demand. So you can see over here, it's in the long run, it's mainly non-US supply shock or US nominal shock. So all these shocks are essentially shifting commodity demand. So they are the main drivers of this fluctuation in the commodity price index, whereas the role of these commodity market shocks in the long run is much smaller. Whereas in the short run, there is a higher contribution of commodity market shocks. So, for example, there is some geopolitical tension, some other conflict that happened somewhere in the world. There is a spike in, say, commodity prices because of that. For example, the Russia-Ukraine or some other event which happened. That is essentially that changes prices in the short run, but then inventories come into play. Other countries increase production, and eventually we don't see that persistent effect from that commodity market shock in the long run. Whereas for the US dollar, we find that movements in the short run are mainly driven by US nominal shocks. And in the long run, it's really the US demand shock which is driving movements in the US dollar. So again, this links to the fact that it's real activity, or at least what we find is that it's real activity which is driving movements in the US dollar exchange rate, and nominal shocks in the long run do not have that big an impact. Then if we go to specific commodities, what we see is that it's crude oil prices are mainly driven again by shocks that shift commodity demand, such as real activity and nominal shocks, whereas commodity specific shocks follow a similar approach, although they have a slightly larger impact on crude oil prices than our commodity price index. But the similarity between the crude oil and the commodity price index is mainly because the commodity price index itself, which is coming from the World Bank's pink sheet on commodities, it's almost 70% of that is essentially crude oil prices. Then for natural gas prices, we find that there's a much larger role of commodity market shocks. And that means that this is reflecting some weather supply or weather related supply disruptions or some inventory shortages. And this is because, and then we also see that there is this US demand shock, which plays a larger role. And this is because the natural gas price we are using here is the US natural gas price. So this is more region specific driven commodity price. So we have these other results for other commodities as well in the paper, but I'm just going to show you the results for these. So just to summarize the overall findings, what we find in this paper is that our very minimum 6-shock SVAR model with these different structural shocks basically captures the joint US dollar commodity price dynamics. And these are two endogenous prices, and there are underlying exogenous drivers which are moving them. They're not, they're affecting each other directly, but there are underlying drivers which are affecting both of them. Then we find that all these shocks, except the US demand shock, basically preserve the negative US demand, US dollar and commodity relationship, whereas it's US only the US demand shock, which basically results in a positive co-movement, and that is key to understanding historical episodes of a positive correlation, including the 2021 episode. And this is important to basically understand this, because for countries that are dependent on commodities, identifying these shocks is useful, because when the US demand, is moving both these prices together, that can raise commodity importers' inflation. It can also erode exporters' revenue. Then finally, we find that the causality essentially runs mainly from the US dollar to commodities, and commodity shocks have a very minimum impact on the US dollar. And US nominal shocks are the main driver of the dollar in the short run, whereas US demand shocks or real activity shocks really drive the dollar in the long run. On the other hand, commodity price index fluctuations are driven more by shifts in commodity demand, with a slightly larger role of commodity-specific supply shocks for the natural gas. So I'm going to stop here, and if you have any questions, I can answer those. So thank you very much.